actuarial, I cannot say that word, the reports. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everyone. Chris Roop, Joint Fiscal Office. I hope you all had a nice holiday since we were last together. We received, and Gail has posted online, and we've distributed 4 documents from the actuaries. So they're dated November 12th, November 16th, November 24th, and most recently, yesterday afternoon, November 30th. These are all in response to request 4, which was it was based on the scenarios that you all put together and asked the actuaries to model back in probably mid to late September at this point. So my goal today is I tried to take some of these documents. The documents are definitely worth reading, but I tried to take these and put them in some plain English into sort of a slide format that we can walk through. So it's a little bit easier to follow, and we can really focus on sort of the substance and the heart of the matter. So the second slide is really page 2 rather. I have the fiscal targets from Act 75 there just to refresh everybody's memories, and just sort of the standard caveats around all this analysis that due to timing, this is based on the FY20 valuation, unless otherwise noted. I don't think you'd really see a huge difference if it was based on the 21 valuation because there wasn't a lot of change to assumptions or anything from year to year. And the caveat that all the scenarios where we are modeling additional revenue are based on sort of the current funding policies and with immediate recognition of that money. So this is not deferring recognition to the end of the amortization period. This is, if that money is immediately recognized to lower future ADACs, like what will the result be? And obviously the analysis assumes all future ADACs are fully funded, all assumptions are met moving forward, and that the non-employee recurring revenue sources cease upon the system reaching 100% funded for modeling purposes. So those are the standard disclaimers that apply to this, but I would be remiss not to repeat them for anybody who's watching on their computers. Let's start with going through the first document, which was the November 12th memo. I have a few slides here. We asked the actuaries to provide us with sort of an opinion or an analysis on some sort of open-ended questions that were a little bit more nuanced than what happens if you change the COLA from this to this. Those 3 questions were for Group F, what would happen if we offered a bonus for each as a longevity incentive to have each member continue working beyond the point of their normal retirement eligibility up to a maximum of 5 years. The bonus is not a defined amount, but we were saying what would happen if incentivized behavior in such a way that we got behavioral assumptions to change as we expect, as we told the actuaries to model, and that extra payment would not come from the pension assets or be factored into their average fund compensation. The second one was taking a look at a Vsers Group C risk sharing COLA, where if the actual investment return is greater than or equal to the assumed rate of return, the status quo COLA formula would apply. But if the investment performance falls short of the assumed rate of return, the COLA would be limited to 1%. The third question we asked them to provide an opinion on was, what would happen or what would be the impact of offering an option for the teachers to have an option to freeze their benefit upon reaching normal retirement and continue working, but not paying pension contributions or accruing more pension benefits during their freeze period. So the analysis is fairly accessible as far as these things go, but I tried to distill it down into a couple bullet points on the following slides and just raise a couple questions that are worth sort of thinking about in your minds that were not analysis, but occurred to me as I was looking at it. Let's start with the Vsers Group F longevity incentive. That's on slide 4. We gave the actuaries, we being you all in your small groups, gave the actuaries some behavioral assumptions model around this. And those assumptions were that 50% of members take advantage of the option would retire after 1 extra year, 10% after 2 extra years, 10% after 3 extra years, 10 after 4, and the remaining 20 would retire after 5 extra years, which is the maximum period of time. And I think the earlier discussion was that last one was chunked into tens instead of a 20, but we needed to make sure the numbers added up to 100 to do this. So the actuaries just rounded that up to 20 for the sake of modeling. So in general, when members retire at a later age than we assume, the pension system is expected to see actuarial gains because that is a year of somebody's life that you're not paying out benefits for. Active members may still see their average final compensation increase through their salary adjustments during their additional years worked. The AFC increases will negate some of the gains from retiring at a later age. So that's just something to keep in mind. Actuaries, whenever they did this analysis, assumed that individuals retiring at very early or very late ages probably were not going to have their behavior changed by offering an incentive. So they did not modify the assumed retirement rates for ages lower than 55 or higher than 72. And they ran two models. They ran a scenario where 100% of eligible members elect to take the incentive and one with 50%. So that gives us a little bit of a range to compare some numbers to. So in the 100% elect option, they predict an unfunded actuarial liability reduction of just shy of $64 million and an 8x savings of 7.6 million. If only 50% elect the option, the unfunded liability savings drops to about 29.2 million, the 8x savings to 3.4 million. Something you should keep in mind here is that although this model shows, based on these assumptions, yeah, you'd see some savings. These projections are highly sensitive to assumptions. And if members have different behavior than these assumptions are assuming, the results are going to be different. So things like the number of members electing to accept the incentive, the ages at which, and of course there's a typo there, I apologize. There may be a few typos in here. I did not have a lot of time to put this together between getting the analysis and today, but the ages at which their retirement rates change also impact the actuarial calculations. So this is one of those things where I think a key takeaway is if behavior turns out the way the assumptions we gave the actuaries to model, if that aligns, you'll see some savings here. You would expect to see some savings here. But deviations in that behavior relative to assumptions can really impact this calculation. Yes, sir.
I know you said we didn't have a kind of amount tied to that bonus there. Do we have any rough thinking on what that might be and how does that get paid, the bonus? Where does that money come from?
That is not an actuarial request, but that was really not in the scope of our work, and that's something you all would have to think about is, you know, where would be, if such a bonus was offered, what is the appropriate amount? What's the universe of people we realistically think are going to accept it? Where is it going to come from? And, you know, you want to make sure that you're offering an incentive that is, you know, not going to end up costing more in the big picture. So you want to make sure the actuarial savings is worth giving the incentive.
So the incentive, to figure out the math, the incentive would have to be less than what they would receive in a pension payment if they were to retire that year?
Not necessarily, because you're looking at different funding sources too. And so we're not assuming you use pension assets to pay this. So it could be something as there could be a general fund appropriation that supports the longevity bonus program or something. Like, it's just, the analysis is sort of agnostic to that question. They're basically looking at, okay, if you offer people an incentive and you think their behavior is going to change by these rates, based on the assumptions currently in place at the time, this is what we think the result would be.
Gotcha.
Thank you. So this was my original, one of my original suggestions. And my thought had been to use some of the money from the $150 million as a set aside to pay these to be determined amount on an annual basis for continued employment. So that answered the question, where would the money come from? We don't have funds in the general fund to do it otherwise, but I would want enough money put in a pot to be able to give us an experience study, 3 years, for example, to determine, is this a good idea or not going forward?
Thank you.
And this is also the type of thing that, you know, you would probably want an independent benefits consultant to really take a look at, like what makes sense in a lot of other places, what have other places done, because a lot of times when incentives are offered to encourage behavior, we don't always get the result that we were hoping for. I would say that's probably the rule more than the exception. And that's not unique to Vermont.
Go ahead.
So Chris, I think when I looked at this one, I mean, one of the big takeaways to me was, you know, to Peter's point, if we're going to set aside $20 million for this, or whatever the number is that the best use of the $20 million in terms of leveraging the impact, right? That was just the open question. And so I think we all have to think about that, weighed against where that could go otherwise.
That is an absolutely ripe question. And I don't have the answer for it.
No, it's something we have to think about.
Yep, absolutely. Okay, any other questions on that before we move on to the fifth slide? Okay, let's take a look at the Vsers Group C risk. Yes, sir.
Sorry, one question as I'm trying to think through all this and reflecting on Mike's comment. The actuaries further define, that age analysis, that kind of the number of members that would be may take advantage of the program. Is that data available for then to us to kind of think about designing some sort of how much money needs to be set aside for that purpose?
I'm sure that data does exist. I don't have it at my fingertips, but they get their modeling data from the state, so that data does live somewhere. And I don't want to sort of waste a whole lot of time on this, but if you're really curious about, when we're talking about retirement assumptions changing, what does that mean? Take a look at the second page of the November 12th memo, and that will show you how they've changed their assumed retirement rates to do this analysis. So that just, sometimes I like to see the example of like, what do you mean? And that's what they did. So,
Thank you.
okay. Slide 5 is the Vsers Group C risk sharing COLA idea. So the actuaries estimate that the pension system will meet or exceed its 7% assumed rate of return roughly half of the time. The COLA assumption currently in place is 2.40%. To account for the risk sharing provision in their modeling, the actuaries reduced the COLA assumption from 2.4 to 1.75. And by changing that assumption, that results in modeled savings to the unfunded liability of 14 million and modeled savings to the ADAC of 2.1 million. There is caveats to this analysis though, and it's that inflation may skew the plan experience in the near term, leading to higher actual costs and overstated modeled savings. So the modeled savings that they looked at are really based on the fact that they would recommend a change in assumptions, and that lowers your normal cost, your accrued liabilities, and that shows up in your ADAC payment. But if your experience deviates from those assumptions, that extra cost is going to be reflected in your unfunded liability. So there's a really, and will be paid in your future ADACs. So there's a lot of uncertainty here with respect to what years the risk sharing provision would kick in, since we cannot exactly predict what the investment performance will be in any given year. And there's also uncertainty regarding the timing and magnitude of the realized savings. And we can sit around and think about, all right, what assumption makes sense based on these parameters that we're putting forth. But at the end of the day, if we're assuming 1.75 and the CPI is at a much, much higher level and we're paying out, a much higher COLA, it's still adding to the unfunded liability. So this is why there's a big caveat to just how this would actually play out in real life experience. And the actuaries did flag in their analysis that the projected savings could be overstated as a result of that. Are there any questions on slide 5 before we move on to slide 6? Okay. This one is about the teacher freeze option. So the actuaries state that it is, generally when you take a look at the value of your pension benefits in retirement, it's their belief based on their analysis that it's much more financially advantageous for a member to continue paying contributions and accruing additional retirement benefits, even if that member already reached their max benefit cap and can only accrue additional benefits through salary growth, driving up their AFC alone, rather than for the additional year of service. They provided some examples here about how if you've got somebody that's, on the less senior end of the retirement spectrum who, entered the workforce at 25 with 34 years and could retire at age 59, that if they had enough service to hit their max benefit cap, so their future pension increases would just be due to their salary growing the longer they continue working, not for every extra year they work. But if that salary continues to grow as they work at the assumed rate of 3.6% for a member at that age, the present value of the additional pension benefits over the course of the member's life from working that extra year is worth in excess of 6 times the value of the member's contribution amount in the first year extra they worked. So this analysis will change a little bit based on what age and longevity that you're dealing with each member. But based on these assumed disparities in the value of future pension benefits, the actuaries are skeptical that many or any members would choose to freeze that option. But I do want to put a big sort of asterisk next to that. There are other factors besides the perceived loss of future pension value that can weigh in on a member's decision whether to freeze their pension benefit. So you may have a member that, salary growth might occur at a lower than assumed rate in the final years of employment, or their AFC may be based on previous years of service rather than their final years of service. They may have had a position earlier in their career where they earned a higher salary than they are currently earning in their final years closest to retirement. Those can all skew the sort of perception of your loss of pension value. Members may also have more pressing needs for the money they pay in pension contributions, or they may choose to take those pre-tax pension contributions and instead, while they're in the freeze, they might want to invest that money according to a strategy that yields higher than 7% return. A freeze will likely result in actuarial gains, but it really depends on who and how many choose to participate. Will anyone choose to participate in? And can this choice be incentivized? I think are key questions you want to think through if this is an option you want to pursue. So those are the types of things that the actuaries can't predict because we didn't tell them to model behavior around this question. But if there are sort of external factors that they're not thinking about beyond just the loss of pension value, I think those are really ripe and important to consider. People make their decisions on more than just one factor.
Molly Stoner, I had a question about this one, because the number 3.6% really jumped out at me with that age. As someone who's on the bottom right corner of a pay scale, meaning I have the highest possible education and years, and I'm at a longevity kind of thing. Salaries increases under 2% annually. And so when I look at the age and think about how most people at that age are probably in that bottom right corner or toward the bottom right corner, maybe not educationally, I just think that's an overstated percentage. And I'm wondering how the results would have changed if it was more like 2 or 2.25. I'm wondering if that's something we could ask them. We might want to ask them to rerun for us. Or if you know why they chose 3.6, I guess.
So I don't know why they chose 3.6. They make these assumptions and recommend them in conjunction with the experience studies every couple of years. And this is something that happens between the boards and the actuaries. I think regardless of what percentage that is, you're still going to have that dynamic where the loss of future pension value will exceed the value of saving that year of contributions. I think the magnitude will vary, but I don't think it's going to fundamentally change the trajectory. I think the real question is, are there tools that can be deployed that make a freeze a more attractive choice for somebody?
Okay, thanks, that's helpful.
Yeah, we had a couple back and forths about this, Chris. Thanks for capturing that in here. Yeah, it seems like it's really kind of that case by case basis for individuals. So even though Siegel doesn't think people might take it, I would say let's not completely rule it out, because I do think there is possibility here for it, especially individuals who maybe don't expect to live as long as others into retirement. That 6,000 might be really valuable to them right then and there, or depending on what their health is in that current moment. So there's a lot of pieces for people to consider individually.
Yeah, and one other thing I'd mention with that is, there could be possibilities to combine the first of the three we just talked about with the Vsers Group F and this. So there could be a possibility where, you don't just give somebody an incentive for working an extra year, you give them an incentive for working an extra year and entering the freeze. So, somebody could get the incentive and keep the employee contributions they're giving. So that could be there could be opportunities to sort of leverage these incentives and combine them so you can get a more actuarially positive result. Okay. If there's no further questions on that, let's move on to the second memo. That's the one dated November 16th. This one focuses primarily on the revenue modeling and on the impact of individual plan change scenarios. So we're going to start by walking through the Vsers scenario on slide 7. You all asked us to ask the actuaries to model 2 scenarios around state revenue. And that would be a $75 million one time with a recurring $15 million revenue source. And the second one was $50 million one time with a recurring $40 million revenue source. What we asked them to model was an assumption that we would pay the one-time money at the end of this fiscal year. So it would show up in the ADAC and be immediately recognized. So it would first show up in the ADAC in FY '24. So we moved it up a year from the prior analysis, just for the sake of comparison. The recurring revenue is based on the similar assumptions we had when we did an analysis a couple months ago, where a revenue source would be enacted in the upcoming legislative session. It would start halfway through FY '23, and the first real full year of base revenue would be in FY '24. And then in future years beyond that, that amount of base year would be presumed to grow at a 2% annual rate. The assumption is that the revenue would be collected over the course of a fiscal year, set aside. The end of the fiscal year, that amount of money collected gets paid into the pension fund above the ADAC payment that was made earlier in the year. These are very generic assumptions, and it's hard to really model this with accuracy when you don't know exactly what the revenue source will be and how it will behave. But these are pretty, reasonable generic assumptions that if you have some unknown revenue source, and if it grows at a relatively modest rate every year, what is the likely impact? And again, the caveat through all this is we're assuming that every assumption is met moving forward. Slide 8, there's a couple things going on here. I took the two different state revenue sources here, compared them against the baseline amortization period payments that were expected to make in a status quo situation based on the FY '20 val. The differences are not huge from the FY '20 to FY '21 val. You could see in the one column, under FY '22, see that one-time payment shows up in each column. And then FY '23 is 5/12 of a year of that base revenue, recurring revenue growth. '24 is that first year of the base, and then it starts growing at 2% after that. The column right to the right of that shows what the new amortization payment would be. And the column to the far right just compares that new amortization payment relative to the baseline. Both scenarios result in ADAC savings beginning in FY '24. The present value of the decrease in employer contributions, which you see on that table over to the right, that reflects the estimated savings cumulatively from next fiscal year through the end of the amortization period in current dollars. So the reason why you see zeros at FY '23 ADAC is because the impact doesn't happen in FY '23. Present value of additional member contributions is 0 because this is not member contributions. This is just about additional state dollars. That present value of the decrease in employer contributions gives you a sense of how much more money this will generate cumulatively in today's dollars toward closing that funding gap. So, yes, sir.
Chris, this is, I assume, net of the additional contributions. The ultimate savings.
I'm sorry,
So-
can you rephrase that?
So let's say for option one, the recurring $15 million contribution. At the bottom line of the table, present value of decrease in employer contributions, that reflects the savings minus the additional contributions. Correct.
This reflects the impact of the additional contribution. So this compares status quo versus if this extra money was flowing in according to these projections, it will save the employer. Option one would save 179 million in present value terms, or 340 million, depending on which scenario. So that's cumulatively over time.
And Chris, is this also in isolation? Like this doesn't include anything like partial 150 million added in?
So my assumption would be that the one time would be part of that 150 million. I mean, it would have to be coming from somewhere, but this is sort of assuming that 75 million would be half of that 150 million.
This is assuming
Would be going in, yeah.
Okay, that's what I was curious about.
I mean, unless Representative Fagan and his colleagues can find 75 or $50 million under a couch cushion, that's probably the first place we would go to try to figure out like where the one-time money would go. And this goes back to several months back when we did the analysis on revenue. We modeled a few scenarios based on how you chop up that 150 million in the different systems. So, that 50 million would be a third of that 150, and 75 would assume that, half of it would go in. Okay. Slide 9. Let's take a look now at employee contributions. I received an email today at 7 o'clock this morning from the actuaries that as they were doing their analysis, they realized that one of their calculations might be off on some of these employee contribution rates. They're going to send us a revision and send that around right away. But what I asked them to do is, if you take a look at the document from Siegel, they presented sort of a here's how much revenue we're expected to get every year. I asked them to do the same thing for the employee contributions. Just, how much would the higher contributions yield every year from now till 2038? In the process of them doing that, they realized one of their earlier calculations might be off. So it doesn't apply. I don't think it applies to Group F. It's more to Group C and the teachers. But I don't expect this is going to be like an error in the magnitude of tens of millions. It's that the one option is probably going to look a little more like the second option. But I just want to let you all know that we got that communication from the actuaries at the crack of dawn today, I think before the sun's even up in Chicago. So as soon as I appreciate the fact that they caught it and that they reached out to us in time for us to mention that to you. But whenever that error is corrected, we will correct these materials and send them around you. It is not going to be a material issue for us today to discuss, like, what do you want to look at next? But anytime there's an error that's going to be coming, I want to make sure you all know that there's going to be a change coming.
Are they providing a discount on their services?
I didn't ask. So for Group F, 2 employee contribution scenarios were modeled. The first one was, there would be no change on contribution rates for folks in the bottom salary quartile. Folks in the middle half, the 25th to 74th percentiles, would see their contributions be increased in a phased way at a 0.5% a year for 3 years beginning in FY23. And the higher earners above the 75th percentile would have an extra year of that salary increase. And just for modeling purposes, I put what those salary percentiles are down at the bottom there. That's what the actuaries use to model. These are relatively close to what actual numbers are. Option 2 was, a very similar concept, but add a year. So it's slightly more impact. So the folks who are between the 25th and 74th, instead of seeing a cumulative 1.5% increase, it go to 2. And then the higher earning folks would see a increase from over a 5-year period instead of a 4-year period. This is the November 16th memo, yes. But it is also broken out separately in the November 24th memo. Yeah, so the 16th memo combined the impact of the higher state revenues and the higher employee contribution rates. And then in response to a request from members of the task force, we asked them, can you break it out separately? So you'll see some combinations here in my analysis that pulls numbers from the 16th and the 24th. So we can see what these look like in isolation. They are also additive too. So, you can look at the revenue stuff separate from the changes to benefit stuff and add the combinations together, because if you're increasing employee contribution rates and doing something on the COLA, those don't necessarily have a negative interaction with one another. So we could sort of mix and match the revenue and changes to the benefit structure.
I just want to say I appreciated that being broken out, because that was a question I was trying to back out of the original analysis.
Yeah.
That was very helpful. Thank you.
Sure thing. So the box up here on the right shows you what the estimated impact of these higher contributions would be in the first year. And again, this doesn't tell the full story because these are phased in contributions, and we'll see whenever they get back to us with their latest analysis, what will those higher contributions yield, not just in sort of FY23 savings, but as they continue to be phased in. So in the first year, option 1 would lower the ADEC by 6.9 million. Option 2 would lower the ADEC by 8.3 million. The present value of the additional member contributions. So that means how much money in today's dollars are these extra contributions going to yield cumulatively over the course of the amortization period? 70.6 million in the first, 84 in the second. You would expect the second to be a little higher because you're phasing in higher contributions in that second one by 0.5% higher than in the first one.
Does that take into consideration the 7% that they?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, all the present value stuff, it all discounts everything according to that 7% rate to today's dollars. So that when you want to compare apples to apples, we talked about that a lot this morning. Looking at present value is a good way to do that. It's a very sound way to do that.
Can you repeat your answer? I didn't catch.
It accounts for the 7%, the discount rate
Okay.
in all the math.
That the investments are assumed rate of return.
And then the present value of the decrease in employer contributions, similar numbers, but slightly different sort of calculation that shows what it would save on the ADEC. So under current policy, these higher employee contributions would pay for a greater share of the normal cost that would show up in the ADEC. So that would be, that's where you would see the savings in the payment. If you were to alternatively say, you know what, let's attribute those to the unfunded liability amortization payment instead of the normal cost, the savings are going to be the same to the employer. But if you want them to say, okay, what would the extra money be if it's paid toward the unfunded liability above the ADEC? That's a different calculation. So this does not reflect that. This just reflects, if our goal is to generate revenue to lower the ADEC, the way to, a good way to do that is to have a greater share of that ADEC payment come from the employee contribution source over time.
Chris, I think you have mentioned this, and I was trying to process something else. In the table where it says FY23 ADEC, does that include how does it treat the stepping up of the ADECs? Would we see a larger savings in FY24, or does that assume it sort of happens in FY24?
You'd see a slightly larger savings in future years because these contributions are being phased in too.
Okay.
So, yeah. And you're also assuming payroll is going to grow and everything else. So, the number will fluctuate a little bit. That's sort of a tricky thing is if we're just looking at the FY23 ADEC and you're doing something that's phased in, obviously you're not capturing the full phase in when you're looking at the first year.
That's what I was trying to get at.
Yep.
Hey, Chris, it's sort of a question relating to that, but in the option 1 and option 2, they show the different amounts. And wouldn't the first 3 years be identical, and then year 4 and year 5 would be different when you add more?
Yes, but the calculation is a little more complicated than that. I would want to ask the actuaries why we don't see the same ADEC savings under the 2 options in the first year.
Yeah, in the first beginning part.
It has to do with the way they model it and the way they space out the costs over time. Okay. Slide 10 takes a look at the Vsers Group C employee contribution scenario. And again, this is the one with the big asterisk that option 1 is likely understated and probably a little more like option 2, but they are running their numbers again and they'll get back to us. But the 2 scenarios that were modeled here were that you increase employee contribution rates by 0.45% a year for 3 years, beginning in FY23. And so that would be across the board, all members, all salary would see those phased in increases. Option 2 is to increase, and it's really not a phased in increase. It's sort of a reset where you would take the universe of employees, break them into salary quartiles, and those quartiles are reflected down at the bottom corner for Group C. The folks in the bottom quartile would see no change in what they're currently paying. The folks in the 25th to the 49th percentile, that second quartile, would see their contribution increase to 9%. And then, so on and so forth. The third quartile would see it go to 10, and everything above the 75th percentile would see it go to 11. And these contribution rates were modeled on the assumption that they would apply to the entire salary amount. So this is a little different than what the teachers asked to model, where it's a progressive and tiered thing. With this, assume that every dollar of your salary is going to be subject to that rate. And the rates are not drastically different from sort of quartile to quartile, but it is a different calculation than what we did for the other group. So I just want to make sure we're aware of that. In this situation, option 1 is expected to yield, both options are expected to yield ADEC savings of less than $1 million in the first year. And the present value of those additional member contributions is in the low millions. It still results in actuarial savings, but we also need to keep in mind that this is a really small cohort of employees. We're talking about around 450 or so members out of a system that has over 8,000 active members. So some of why these numbers aren't that big is because Group C is a very, very small percentage of the total universe of Vsers members.
Sorry, Megan. Can you remind me what the current percentage is that Group C pays?
8.53.
Okay, thank you.
So slide 11, this takes a look, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I just want to illustrate here that I took each of the 2 state revenue scenarios that Vsers employee groups asked us to model. And then the actuaries added, the actuaries did the analysis and then I added them together. All right, what happens if you take that state revenue and then add each of the 4 different employee contribution scenarios to it? What changes on the amortization schedule? You'll see if you take a look under state revenue, under the one-time 75 million, recurring 15, now that moves the needle quite a bit and reduces the amortization payments relative to the base. But then when you read across the columns, you really don't see any extra difference whenever you add employee contributions to it. The differences are really, really small though. And I noticed that and I'm like, I didn't expect this to change if employee contributions fund the normal cost and not the unfunded liability. Actuaries said, yes, that's a great catch. What's going on here is when your contributions change, that influences the accrued liability calculation. And whenever somebody works for a couple years making higher contributions and then leaves without being vested and their contributions are refunded to them, that is in a slightly different calculation on the accrued liability line, which then in turn influences what the unfunded liability would be. So that's why you see a really, really small difference. So this goes like in FY24, minus 6.6 with the state, minus 6.5, 6.6, like there's really no meaningful difference whenever you add the extra employee contributions onto the amortization payment.
So I think it was Colorado, I believe, who did that part where they automatically kept their funds in if they weren't vested and they got a return that was lower than the assumption. If we were to include something like that, that would change these numbers.
It likely would, but I don't think you're going to see a massive magnitude of change as a result.
Just trying to keep in mind the idea of helping a solution by multiple avenues as opposed to one silver bullet.
Yep, understood.
That also depends on behavior, right? Because it was a choice. that
Right,
people
and
made.
they were automatically set up initially, right, to be,
If they
kept in.
chose to. They didn't have to leave.
they could elect into it or
Right,
not.
yeah.
Yeah, they could choose to leave their assets.
Right.
And there was an incentive for them to do so, but it was still a choice.
Right, it was a choice. Too
Yeah.
bad we have to take into account human behavior.
Yeah, it's one of those things where if you're given an employee who's kind of earlier in their career, that's typically what we're dealing with a terminated or with the member who I think we call it inactive now, a member who leaves before they're vested and they're entitled to a refund of their contributions. It's probably someone who's a little closer to my age than somebody who's a little closer to retirement doing that. I think you can really credibly raise the question of how many members are going to keep their contributions in and accept some rate lower than 7% when you could instead take that money, put it into your own sort of directed tax advantage retirement account and likely yield a much higher return over the course of your life. So it is a very fair question.
Good way to get diversified early on, though.
Slide 12, I am not going to spend much time on, but this is the same data that you saw in slide 11. The only difference is I added the second revenue scenario in here instead of the first. The story here is that, the savings that accrue under current policy from higher employee contributions really don't do very much on the amortization payment half of the unfunded liability. You really do see it on the, or of the ADAC payment. You see the benefit on the normal cost, but there are very, very small fluctuations from year to year. And that's just due to the sort of weirdness of how we accrue liabilities and have to refund contributions. Slide 13 takes a look at Vsers Group C. So now we're starting to get into some of the plan change options and away from the revenue options. These are all looking at them in isolation right now, and then I'll go through and look at the combinations that we got in yesterday. But right now, everything you're looking at is just assuming that only that option is done and no other changes are made to the benefit structure. So option one was increasing the max benefit cap by 1% of AFC for each year work beyond reaching the ladder of age 50 or 20 years service, and increases the mandatory retirement age from 55 to 57. The only difference between option one and option two is option two presumes a 2% of AFC increase. And again, the current benefit multiplier is 2.5% a year. There's a really key thing I want to spend a minute talking about. Over here in the right corner, whenever we ask the actuaries to look at this, we gave them some retirement assumptions to model. So we assumed, and again, this experience can always deviate from assumptions, but based on what we gave the actuaries to model, we said, let's assume that 50% of people are just going to keep retiring at age 50. And then of the other half, 10 would retire at each age from 51 through 53, 5 at each age from 54 through 56, and 100% would retire by age 57, which would be the new mandatory retirement. Based on those changes to behavioral assumptions that we gave them, they expect that both options will yield actuarial savings. Obviously, the first one will result in slightly more actuarial savings, $3.3 million savings from the ADAC and $22.5 million from the unfunded liability. Option two, $2.3 million savings on the ADAC, $15.4 million on the unfunded liability. Slide 14 takes a look at all of the Group F Vsers plan changes, again, individually. And I tried to make this a little easier to follow than in the actuarial reports, but I may not have succeeded. So if I confuse you or if you have any questions, just shout them out. But there are 6 options of individual changes to plans that the Group F working group asked the actuaries to take a look at. Option one was setting a COLA threshold in the first $24,000 of pension income every year. So, the COLA would adjust just the first $24,000 of pension income. Any annual income you get in retirement above $24,000 would not be subject to the COLA. Option two, similar vein, but it indexes the $24,000 threshold to the CPI from FY24 onward. And again, this is predicated on the CPI assumption in place for the plan. I think it's very reasonable to expect that the actual CPI is going to be a little bit higher than assumptions in the foreseeable near-term future. So that's just a grain of salt we want to throw out with this analysis. Option three reflects updating the minimum and maximums so instead of the 1%, 5% that we have right now, to go from a 0% minimum and a 4% maximum on the COLA. Option four, right now the rule is you get a COLA after you've been in retirement for 12 months, for a year. Option four looks at what happens if you require 24 months of retirement before the first COLA. And option five says, what if you require 36 months? Then option six is increasing the max benefit by 1% of AFC for each year work beyond the current maximums. Let's take a look at the table. You'll see that the first 5 options all yield actuarial savings. Option six does not yield actuarial savings. It actually yields a higher actuarial cost. The reason for that is because, unlike in the last analysis, we did not ask the actuaries to model any changes to behavior. If we can do that if there are options you would like us to tell them to model. But the reason why this shows a actuarial loss is because they already assume that there's some percentage of the workforce that's going to keep working past the point at which they stop earning retirement benefits through extra years of service alone. We all know people who have been, 40-year employees who, they aren't accruing an extra service credit enhancing their benefit, though it will increase with their AFC. But for a variety of reasons, they love their jobs, they're very dedicated to serving the public, they continue to keep working. The actuaries, their model, they take this 1% max benefit cap, and it essentially processes it as a benefit enhancement to that group of people who are already presumed to keep working. we are to say, you know what, if we offer this, we think retirement behavior is going to change by some percentage. That will change this calculation. But the reason why the one you saw on group C on the last page is a gain and this one is a loss is because group C gave us different retirement behavior assumptions to model and group F just reflects this quote. Does that make sense?
Yes, I think that makes perfect sense. And I was just gonna ask why it worked out differently for group C than group F. So if we were to ask the actuary to say something like 10% of people that choose to, the amount of people that could choose to continue to work would increase by 10% or something, that would refine the analysis.
Yeah, that's the type of thing. You know, it's like how many people do you assume are going to work longer than they otherwise would? And based on them, what percentage of that cohort do you think are going to work 1 extra year, 2 extra years, so on and so forth. So those are the types of things that they would need to adjust in order to change this. But again, you know, we can make assumptions and tell them to model the assumptions. At the end of the day, how well the experience jives with those assumptions is really going to determine whether we are gaining or losing ground here. But when I saw that, I was like, huh, that's interesting. And I know some of you all reached out separately too. When we circled back with the actuaries, that's the explanation, and it makes perfect sense.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's very helpful.
Okay, slide 15. So all of the COLA changes individually result in actuarial savings. This shows the impact of the amortization payments of the different changes made in isolation. So, you know, you'll see that the two on the right, the two columns on the right speak to group C. And, you know, these are not additive. You should just read down these columns individually because this is all about individual impact. But that max benefit cap by 1% of AFC for group C results in savings that start at 1.9 million in the ADAC in FY23 and move on up. And you could see that, you know, in a similar vein, all the way across the table, these different changes would be expected to yield lower amortization payments than were, you know, our baseline in a status quo situation. But, you know, you see those numbers are in positive territory on the far right. And that's because of that issue of we didn't adjust the assumptions. Slide 16 starts getting into what I think you're all more interested in, and that's starting to look at the combinations of multiple options. So I tried to make this a little bit more readable than what was in the report we got on November 30th. Again, I hope I met that expectation, but I may have fallen short. But there are a lot of combinations here that mix and match different options around the COLA and the max benefit cap. And there are a few that have an asterisk at the top, and I think they're shaded in red. Those signify the runs that exclude active employees who are within 5 years of normal retirement eligibility as of this upcoming July 1st. So that's just to give you a comparison of, okay, if these changes are made to the entire universe of employees versus carving out folks who are within 5 years of retirement, how do the numbers look different? And the change, what we did exempt them from, the 5 years within retirement is not exempted from the max benefit cap increase because it wouldn't make sense to do that because that's a population you would be wanting to encourage to continue working. But what was exempted were the changes to the COLA. So that was what the actuaries just did not model changes to the COLA on the folks retirement eligibility in those scenarios. You could see on page 16, there are 6 different combinations here, and I listed at the top what each factor is in each one. So you could see at the bottom, I don't want to go through every single one of these individually unless you have questions, but you can see the sort of collective impact of, if you were to just reset the CPI threshold from the current 1% minimum, 5% max to 0 min, 4 max, and delay the COLA for 24 months of retirement instead of 12, you know, that yields you $5.4 million in ADAC savings, $35.4 million in the unfunded liability. That's how you should read these charts going across. You'll notice that there are some scenarios here, like combo F, and most of the ones later on that also add the increased max benefit of 1% issue. Remember from the previous slide, we did not make changes to behavioral assumptions. So that in isolation yielded an actuarial loss. But there are scenarios where if you combine that with other changes to the COLA, in the aggregate, the changes to the COLA sort of offset some of the actuarial losses from that 1% factor and still yield you an overall actuarial savings. So you see that in like combo F, when you throw in that increased max benefit by 1%, you're still in savings territory there. Negatives are good with these numbers. Positives are bad. Yes, sir.
For the impact numbers down there, is that in one fiscal year or is that cumulative?
The unfunded liability impact is, I believe it's cumulative, and the ADAC impact is for one fiscal year.
Okay. So then let's just, if we use combo A, the ADAC impact is going to be a minimum of 5.4, based on all the assumptions, is going to be 5.4 million each year.
Correct.
Likely to increase.
Yeah, that's year one's ADAC savings. And again, the statute's kind of vaguely worded around the fiscal targets, but it's all sort of about, if 100% of the Vsers reduction scenario is $36 million or 36.1 on the ADAC, I would count 5.4 on my list of ways to get to 36.
Right.
And maybe add a little nuance because I might have not answered your first part of your question right. The unfunded liability impact reflects, okay, if you make this change, the current balance of the unfunded liability would be reduced by that much. So it's a slightly different way of answering the question because all these things are discounted over time. So I want to make sure we're comparing apples to apples. But these numbers here is what I would work off of when trying to figure out how you get to those fiscal targets.
Thank you.
There's just a question about the asterisks. You referred to the asterisks in the red, and I don't see either on my page.
Oh, no.
The next page.
Yeah, next page.
Oh, the next page.
Yeah, I'm sorry. So like combo I and J, you'll see them there.
Thank you.
Way to be a good student and not jump ahead, Molly.
What's that?
I said, way to be a good student, not jump ahead.
I'm so focused on time.
So I'm not sure if you all have any questions. I don't know if we necessarily need to spend time walking through every single one of these. I hope that this chart is fairly straightforward to sort of compare how the different combinations of options work together. This is an area where, if you're adding more than one change to the benefits, you really, really do want to make sure they're all being costed out together. And this is what this shows, because if you add up the individual options on a prior slide, you will get a different number than here. And it's because these interact with one another differently and change people's behavior and their calculations differently. What you can add, though, what is additive is taking the impact of benefit changes to the impact of additional revenue. You can add that together fairly straightforwardly because they don't interact with each other the same way. And on slide 17, the only thing I wanted to point out here really was, G and I, combo G and combo I look at the exact same things. So does combo H and combo J. But you can see the difference in numbers whenever you exempt folks who are with 5 years of normal retirement eligibility from those COLA changes. Okay, there's more on slide 18, but unless you want to spend a lot of time on it, we can keep on trucking to the teacher scenarios that start on page 19. All right. So for the teachers asked us to take a look at two different, just like with the Vsers, model two different state revenue scenarios. One would be 97.5 million one-time money. 97.5 million roughly corresponds to 65% of the 150 million, with a recurring 32.5 million revenue source. In the second bullet point, same 97.5 million in one time, but with a $50 million recurring revenue source. Same assumptions apply here to how we're looking at working these numbers, these additional revenue numbers into the math. Slide 20, and I apologize that the page number is covered, will show you, just like on a previous slide for Vsers, if you take a look at just these two different revenue options, what will that yield you in expected savings in ADAC amortization payments over time? So you'll see in FY24 is when you first see the impact show up in the ADAC calculation, because it's 2 years after the one-time money goes in and at the end of FY22. And then over time, you see that savings increase. The present value of the decrease in employer contributions cumulatively, from FY 23 to 38 expressed in today's dollars would be $331.4 million in the first option and 463.9 for the second option. So just like with the state scenario, the additional revenue yields savings in the future, which we would obviously expect.
One of the things I just need a little bit of help with, Chris, is so looking at just option one, let's use an FY 24, that minus 8.5 savings from the base.
Yeah.
Is that the reduction of ADEC payment then is 8.5 million?
Yeah, so the amortization payment is part of the ADAC. The other part of it is what the employer pays to fully fund the normal cost. So if you could read that in FY 24, under a status quo situation, if we were assumed to pay 170.9 for the amortization payment, it would instead drop down to 164.4. And that does not reflect the entire ADAC, but that reflects the biggest component of the ADAC. And that is the payment toward the unfunded liability. Because these numbers are all going into the unfunded liability, this extra money. I would not read down the column and add up all those negatives and say, we're going to save $813 million. I would not read this that way. I put these comparisons here so you could see the change from year to year. But when you start looking at, Kate's a math teacher and she could probably explain present value a whole lot more eloquently than I can. But when you're looking at really long-term cash flows, you want to discount everything to today's dollars. So that's why that present value of decrease in employer contributions is really the good number to use to be like, all right, how much would this actually save us over time expressed in today's dollars? Because we express our liabilities and our assets in today's dollars also. Everything's discounted. Okay. Slide 21, takes employee contributions for the teachers. And again, we put the asterisk here that the actuaries might be getting us a revision because option one's numbers might end up looking a little closer to option two's numbers. So option one was a phased in 0.25% a year increase in employee contributions. So folks who are currently paying 5% would see 0.25 point increases for 4 years beginning in FY 23. And the members currently paying 6% would see 0.25 point a year increases for 2 years beginning in FY 25. Option two is scrapping the current system of sort of flat rates and adopting a progressive structure. This is different than what we modeled for Vsers Group C. This works like an income tax. So the way this would be structured is your first $40,000 of income, you'd pay a rate of 5.5% on. On the dollars of income that you earn between 40,000 and 60, you'd pay 6.25% on, and so on and so forth. When you do the math and figure out, all right, what is somebody making 50, 60, 75, or $100,000 gonna actually pay as a percentage of their total check? The effective rates you'll see here, over here on the right side of the bottom. So really, the break-even point with these numbers is at $75,000. It's people who are earning less than that may, depending on their date of hire, may see a contribution reduction. People who are earning higher than 75,000 would see a contribution increase. So there's a different sort of situation going on here. Yes, sir.
Or if they're at 75,000 and paying 5% right now, they would be paying more at 6%.
Correct. But that's sort of the break even of where somebody hired today would be paying 6%.
Right.
So the break even there is right at 75.
Yeah.
And you could see that, again, these numbers are going to be refined, but the first option yields you about 24.6 of additional member contributions over time. The second one, more, 46 million. And that results in very comparable decreases in employer contributions on a present value basis from now to the end of the amortization period.
The email you get today, that references option one potentially being closer to option two dollar amounts, possibly.
That's what they said it may be, but I want to see the numbers and see them do the analysis. So, but I don't think you're going to see these numbers go from 2.9 to 20.9. I think you're going to see them move, relatively small in magnitude. Okay. Slide 22 is a similar chart that I did for Vsers, but it's simplified because there were fewer revenue combinations here. So the first one, the Vsers working group asked us to put together, take there were 2 state revenue options and 2 employee contribution. Was basically matched the first state revenue and first employee with the second state revenue and second state employee. So there's 2 comparisons here. It's not going to make a meaningful difference how you mix and match these, but the key takeaway here is, you see the additional state revenue going toward the unfunded liability reduces your amortization payments in the future compared to the baseline. And you see pretty minimal changes to the baseline amortization periods when you layer in additional employee contributions. So it goes back to the same issues with, it just kind of changes the calculation slightly about how liabilities accrue and shed for members who get their contributions refunded. Slide 23 takes a look at the individual benefit options that the Vsers working group asked us to take a look at. Option 1 was a COLA threshold where, the 50% of CPI would apply, which is the current rate, but on the first 48,000 of annual pension income. Then a lower CPI, 25% of CPI on pension income above 48,000. You can see that yields some modest actuarial savings, 2.1 million on the ADAC, 14.1 million on the unfunded liability. Option 2 was to move to a tiered COLA where 100% of CPI would be used for calculating the COLA on the first 20,000 of annual pension income, 50% of CPI on the income between 20 and 40,000, 25% of CPI on income above 40,000. You'll see that that is an actuarial loss. That's actually a benefit enhancement for many people who currently only have every dollar based on 50% of CPI. So that's why that shows a modest actuarial loss there. Option 3 is vested COLA, where instead of just being entitled to a COLA when you have your 5 years of service and you get your pension, instead require a minimum of 15 years of service in order to get a COLA on your benefit in retirement. Yields small savings, 1.1 million on the ADAC, 3.4 million on the unfunded liability, but not a very large impact. In option 4, you have a similar thing going on here with this increased max benefit, where it shows a modest actuarial. I wouldn't say it's necessarily a modest actuarial loss. It's a almost $4 million increase to the ADAC and $30 million increase to the unfunded liability. And this goes back to the fact that we're not making changes. We didn't make changes to behavioral assumptions. So if this is based on the current assumptions in place at the time, if you change those assumptions, or if behavior ends up being much more favorable than you assume, that number would be different. So slide 24 just again shows you, okay, let's take a look at those benefit options individually. What impact would they have on the amortization payments? And the reason why the benefit changes impact the amortization payments a little more is because when you change the benefit structure, that reduces either increases or reduces the liability you need to pay off. So that's why you see the benefit changes show up here, whereas the higher employee contribution rates don't show up. So you can see that the first and third options, the ones that yield actuarial savings on the prior page, yield modest savings to the baseline amortization payments, but the second and fourth options do not. So, there's sort of an open question here that, if we are to move forward on the max benefit cap situation, what changes to retirement behavior should we be assuming as part of that analysis? Slide 25 combines, we're almost done. Slide 25 combines options into combinations. And there's fewer here because there were fewer individual options to analyze and therefore fewer combinations to put together than on the state employee side. So if you take a look here at combo A is just, taking that COLA threshold where the 50% of CPI, the sort of status quo CPI is only on the first 48,000 of benefit, and you increase the max benefit by 1%, it actually yields an increase to the unfunded liability by 14.7 million and the ADAC impact by 1.7 million. All of these combinations, and these I should have reflected on here, all these numbers reflect millions, but all of these combinations are in positive territory. So that means they result in actuarial losses. What is driving those actuarial losses is the fact that the increased max benefit cap option was layered in without a change to assumptions. And the savings that you're expected to yield from changing the COLA are not large enough to offset the expected actuarial losses from the 1% max benefit increase. So that's what's happening here. slide 26, 27, 28, and 29. I am not going to spend a lot of time on unless you have a question. But what I tried to do here was pull all of this out into some tables that are a little bit easier for us to follow. So as we want to take a look at in one clear place, what do these combinations or what are these options likely to yield in savings? You can read across the table and see that. So page 26 is looking at the revenue options. So I did like every combination I could based on what I had to sort of split out like the state revenue, the different contributions, and different combinations of them to show you what the impact would be in sort of consistent terms. Slide 27, I did the same for benefit change options, but again, these are all individual impacts. So these are not in a combination. These are, if you only do one of these, this is the impact that the actuary said we're likely to see. So the first two, that longevity bonus and risk sharing COLA, they came from the first memo we got, and the rest of them come from the ones we got second and third memos. So if you read down these columns, again, negatives are good. Those mean we are saving ADAC and reducing unfunded liability. But that bottom one there is in positive territory. That's that max benefit, and that's because we didn't change an assumption to retirement behavior. So 28 and 29 are the same types of data, but for the teacher system. And with that, I'm going to shut up and answer any questions you may have.
So I'm going to ask a question here, and this is probably, should have been asked the very first day we were here. But I'm looking at the increases to contributions in F, C, and Vsers.
Mhm.
And I may be wrong here, but it seems to me that the teachers are paying not very much, a very high percentage. Is that true? The group F would go up to 8.6%. C would go up to 11, and the teachers would go up for the highest percentile to 6.5. So I'm not sure if I'm missing something here, but it says, am I wrong?
No, I have a response. Can I go in?
Yeah.
So one of the things that I had wondered about that also through this whole process, I've been noticing differences in the plans. And to me, it's really a whole picture. So I agree that our contributions are lower as teachers than state employees. I also note that they have a rule of 87 and we have a rule of 90. I also note that they have 100% COLA and we have 50% of CPI. And so I sort of see those things balancing each other out. And I don't really know the math behind that in terms of who has the better picture, if there is one, but I would caution any and all of us from looking at one of those factors in
Yeah.
isolation.
Yeah, I just wonder, it just struck me when I was looking at this.
If I can respond to that, and I agree with everything you both just said. If you take a look back a few meetings ago, or maybe it was the last meeting, it's all blurring together, about the group subsidization. Different plans and different groups have different normal costs for their benefits. So if you look across all Vsers groups, the normal cost at the end of FY20, I think, was 12.67% of pay. And employee contributions across all groups paid, I think, about 53 or so percent of that 12.67%. The total normal cost for the teacher pension system was a little bit less. It was 11.02%. And the teacher contribution rates were paying about 49 or 50% of that total. So, you know, there's differences in how much the benefit package costs from group to group. I have no idea how folks decided to set contribution rates the way they did when they did. You know, I think there was lots of factors at play in those decisions. But I think that is something to sort of keep in mind, is that people pay different rates, but the cost of their benefits also varies from system to system.
And if I'm, again, I'm no historian, but I'm guessing at some point, I'm just going to use Group C as an example. If we asked for a more generous benefit, I'm sure we have to agree to pay a higher rate to that too.
Yeah.
Yeah, and one other thing to keep in mind is, you know, when they take a look at the normal cost, that is based largely on the actuarial assumptions in place at the time. So, if you drop your assumed rate of return from 7.5 to 7, for example, the normal cost goes way up. But employee contributions don't necessarily keep pace because they're set in statute with changes in the normal cost. So if you go back a few years, 2 years ago, employee contributions paid a much greater share of the total normal cost than they now do because the total went up. And we put a chart in the interim report from October that illustrates that. But that's another dynamic that plays into this as well. Like as the world has sort of changed and economic assumptions have been changed, the demographic assumptions have been revised. In sort of layman's terms, the price of the pension benefit went up.
Chris, I think you make a really good point that looking at it as the percentage of normal cost kind of normalizes for a lot of those differences, for lack of a better word, but just provide a little bit of history. I think it was in 2007 where state employees agreed to pay more to increase that COLA in retirement tax. So the idea was that those additional contributions were to accrue for a period of time until that benefit was paid for and it would go into effect. So there is some history there as to how some of the differences evolved, and whether that's been how that's worked out cost wise, I don't know, but I just thought that would be helpful.
Yeah, and that's a really good point too. I do want to note that there's been lots of changes to the system in the last 15 years or whatever. Not every change has been a benefit loss. There have been combinations of there might be an increase in contributions, but certain other aspects of the benefit package have been enhanced. It all comes down to sort of when everything washes out, is the big picture in more positive territory or negative territory. So like one example is, some groups have seen their max benefit go from 50% to 60% of AFC. So, there's things like that at play where not every change has been a cut. There have been some offsetting gains too, but in the big picture, it's all about like, are we ending up in positive territory or negative territory when you add everything together?
Chris, is there a way to, these numbers, I'm wrong, please, but these numbers are based on valuations from Pat, like they don't include the current, like when Tom came in to testify about, the fund and where it is, that these valuations are not based on that. Is there a way to take that into account?
So you're not going to see a huge difference. The valuations, the new, what we're comparing things to is the previous baseline numbers. So like if we're saying, the ADEC is going to drop by $1 million, we're comparing it to the baseline from a year ago. I don't really think the FY21 valuation is going to materially change the numbers when you filter that in, because it didn't change, assumptions didn't really change. So you might see some modest changes here and there, but we had some really great returns, which is going to help how much money is in the fund, and it helped the funded ratio and everything else. But we also had some offsetting losses and things like that too. So when everything shakes out, we're not really a whole lot further off track right now than we were a year ago. The unfunded liabilities grew in both systems slightly in dollar terms, but not in relative terms. So we sort of saw the dollars go up, but the funded ratio improve at the same time. And that's when you visualize it's because liabilities went up, but the assets went up more. So the gap changed a little bit. So it's a little bigger in dollar terms, but in relative terms, it's closer together. I don't think it would really make a huge difference.
Any more comments, questions for Chris right now? So, yeah, I know.
I'm sorry, Leona.
So what I'm going to make a suggestion here is that we go to lunch, that we've seen pretty stark contrast between the Vsers and the Vsers, if that's what we want to call them. And maybe talk with each other over lunch and see where we might learn from each other and do some sharing. Come back here at 1:15 and we'll spend half an hour just kind of generally discussing, and then we'll go into our groups. And I think that one of the things that needs to happen in the small groups is, for example, the state employees have so many combinations there that they're going to need to start looking at them and say, these are the ones that we want to go with, and we're going to just get rid of these and stuff, because we need to
Right,
start
'cause-
focusing down.
Right, because
Yeah,
ideally, we end up, 2 weeks from today with recommendations that go into a report, so.
so does that make sense to do it that way?
We will talk at lunch.
Okay. So we will be back, and we are set for 2 breakout rooms, since Dan is going to be joining the VSEA members. So one group will be in this room and one across the hall in 9.